Hello, here's another summary of our discussion at our core community group. Last Thursday we were discussing John 13. So John 13 features three sections. The first section, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. The second section, Jesus predicts his betrayal. And the third section, Jesus predicts Peter's denial. Now, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Some background to this is we thought we would go through the Bible and look at various references to foot washing, because it is surprising the number of places it appears, and there's a lot of stories that we're familiar with, and yet very likely if we said, can you list the places in the Bible that feature foot washing, we wouldn't be able to think of many. So we just thought it'd be an interesting exercise to go through where the Bible refers to foot washing. So the first one we started off with is Genesis 18 verses 1 to 5, and this is where Abraham is visited by God, basically, and two angels. Three people appear to Abraham, and Abraham says, my Lord, if I have found favour in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, and I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort your hearts. After that ye shall pass on, for therefore have you come to your servant. And they said, do so, as you have said. So these strangers turn up, and Abraham not only invites them to have something to eat, but also to wash their feet. And the idea really is that people would have travelled through walking a lot of times in the ancient world, and they would have worn sandals, so their feet would have got hot and dirty, and it was just a hospitable thing to do, to provide some water so people could wash their feet. It would have cooled their feet, and it would have made them clean, obviously, as well. So it's something that when somebody comes to you, you wouldn't just offer them something to eat and drink, you'd also give them some water to wash their feet. So that's the first example that we have. The second example happens shortly afterwards, and this is when these the two angels go down into Sodom and they visit Lot. And so this is Genesis 19 verses 1 and 2, and Lot says, behold, my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night, and wash your feet, and you shall get up early and go on your way. And they said, no, we will abide in the street all night. So in this he doesn't even actually say have something to eat and drink. He literally says you can sleep here and you can wash your feet. So that was sort of maybe one of the essential things that you would say this to somebody, to make them comfortable. A little bit later on, still in Genesis, this is Genesis 24 1 to 4 and 32 to 33. So this is basically the story of Isaac and Rebecca. So in the story, Abraham obviously has moved away from where his family was, and he's had a son, Isaac, but he wants Isaac to marry someone from sort of more closely related to him, not one of the sort of like his own people, if you like, and not any of the tribes in the land where he's living. So he sends his servant back down to his relations where he came from, and the servant arrives, and he says to himself, I think maybe he says a prayer, that he's looking for a bride, obviously, for Isaac, and he says, right, well, I'll go to the well, and if the woman comes over and offers to draw water from the well, then she'll be the person that will be right for Isaac. So it says, so the servant came Oh, and so, sorry. So he finds Rebecca, and he identifies himself and gives her some gifts. He gives her some gold, actually. And she then says, "Come to my brother's house." And so he goes to Laban's house, which is Rebecca's brother. And it says, he ungirded his camels, he gave straw and provider for the camels, and water to wash the servants' feet and the men's feet that were with him. So again, a sign of hospitality. He was being welcomed in, and as a sign to show he was welcome, they gave him water to wash his feet. Right, next one. Still Genesis 43, 19 to 25. This is when Joseph is now in a position of authority in Egypt, and his brothers have gone to Egypt because there's a famine in the land of Canaan, and they hear that there's food in Egypt, so they go to Egypt to try and get some food. And as they're leaving, Joseph kind of plays a trick on them and puts palace silver, or puts some silver of some origin, but not theirs, put some silver in their sacks which had the food in. Anyway, when they look in the sacks, they start to travel back. When they look in the sacks, they see that this silver that they didn't put there is in there, so they go back to Egypt to return it. And it says the men go into Joseph's house, and he gives them water, and they wash their feet, and he gave food for their donkeys as well, or their asses. So when they return back to Joseph, he gives them water to wash their feet. Again, a sign of hospitality. In Judges 19:21, this is the story of the Levite and his concubine, and they're travelling through the land, and they stop at a house for the night, and it says that the man at the house brought them into his house. He gave food for their asses, and they washed their feet, and they ate and drank. So again, this time eating and drinking was involved. Not very, very common when you invited somebody in, you give them water to wash their feet. Next one is 1 Samuel 25, 39 to 42. David has had trouble with this guy who turns out to be Abigail's husband. So there's a woman in this called Abigail, who is very respectful to David, but her husband is very disrespectful, and the husband dies, possibly some sort of judgment from God or something for being an idiot. Anyway, so Abigail then approaches David. She arose, she bowed herself on her face to the earth, and said, "Behold, let thy handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of the Lord." And this is really quite an interesting verse, because very often people are just given water and they say, like, "Here's some water, you can wash your feet." The idea, I suppose, is that maybe you'd have servants that would wash visitors' feet as well, so if some visitors come in, the servants would wash their feet for them. This is the only text that I'm aware of, apart from obviously when Jesus does it, where somebody is offering to wash somebody else's feet. In the Old Testament, because there's also, we'll come to another one in the New Testament actually, but as you can tell from most of these verses, it's just like, here's some water, get on with it. But in this particular one, Abigail offers to wash the feet of David's men, I suppose. I will, she says, "I will wash the feet of the servants of my Lord." So not even just washing David's feet, but washing the feet of his men, I guess. 2 Samuel 11, 6 to 9. This is the story of David and Bathsheba and Uriah. David sends word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So we know that David's had sex with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, and I don't know if she says she's pregnant, I don't know. Anyway, he's worried about her getting pregnant, and he wants Uriah to have sex with his wife, but Uriah's in the army, and they're off fighting wars. So he needs to get Uriah to come back, have sex with Bathsheba. That way, if there's any child, Uriah will think it's his. So Joab is the captain of David's army, so he sends words to the leader of the army, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. Uriah says to him, Uriah comes to David, and David asks him how is Joab, and how the soldiers were, and how the war is going. And then it says, then David says to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. So I suppose really wash your feet in this sense is kind of, make yourself comfortable, wash the dirt off from your journey, and go in your house and hopefully make yourself at home, as it were. But he doesn't, as we know. Uriah is given every opportunity to procreate, but feels that it wouldn't be right if all of his mates in the army can't do it, then he doesn't, with their wives, then he doesn't want to do it with his wife. So unfortunately, as a result of that, David has him killed, of course. Now, that was the last of the Old Testament passages. We next come to New Testament and Luke 7:44 to 46. It says, and he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered into your house, though gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with tears and wiped them with the hairs of her head. So very how to describe it really, very tactile, a very emotional scene really, with this encounter in Luke. It's a bit difficult to say whether there was like two cases of this happening, because obviously we've also had the story in the previous chapter of John, of Mary putting oil on Jesus's feet and washing his feet with like perfume and so on. And this is kind of a similar story, but not exactly identical, so sometimes people see it as the same and sometimes they see it as something different. Anyway, point is, the one in Luke, she's washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. So again, a very emotional response, and it's the woman is kind of obviously put herself in a position of a servant of washing someone's feet, but doing it with tears and wiping them with her hair. So it's a very emotional and heartfelt action on the part of the woman, obviously. The last one we'll look at before circling back to John 13 is 1 Timothy 5 verses 9 and 10. And these are sort of instructions for when widows should be helped. It says, no widow may be put on the list of widows unless she's over 60 and has been faithful to her husband and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. So this is the only example we kind of get in the Bible as to whether washing of feet, of washing each other's feet, or washing people's feet within the church environment, was this some sort of act of remembrance? Because let's go back to John 13 now. John 13, 14 and 15, Jesus says, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Now apparently in the early church fathers, there are references, but they never go into any detail of foot washing. Really kind of similar to this one in 1 Timothy 5. You know, all it says is that the widow shows hospitality and washes the feet of the Lord's people. Now, it could be that, as we saw in a lot of those cases, the people would just, in the Old Testament, people would just be like, here's some water, you can wash your feet. And Jesus obviously kind of goes beyond that by getting the water and washing the feet of the other person. So in other words, adopting the role of a servant, the way a servant might wash somebody's feet. And it may be that what they're referring to is when you invite somebody into your house, you don't just give them some water to wash their feet with, that you actually would wash the feet, and that would be a sign of humility, rather than just giving them water themselves to wash their own feet with. Whether it was more than that, so, you know, would it be like within a church environment that people would wash each other's feet? Because obviously this is something which in the ancient world was a thing, right? You know, you would have walked somewhere, you would have come to somebody's house, they would say come in, and they would, and you know, the idea of being hospitable to people, being you know, well behaved towards them, would be to offer them water or to provide water for their feet. The question is, should this be done in a somewhat artificial manner? Because nowadays, and you know, we don't give people water to wash their feet, and so therefore we wouldn't have the opportunity of saying, oh, when somebody needs to have their feet washed, you know, go ahead and do it. And there's quite a few denominations who have taken Jesus's words literally about, you know, you should wash one another's feet, and who include that as part of like a regular church practice. So maybe sometimes when they have communion, they might wash each other's feet prior to communion and then take communion. If you look it up in Wikipedia about the practice of foot washing, you can see like a list of different denominations, and they do this in different ways. I think the Anglicans have a certain sort of ceremony, and even maybe the Catholics, maybe the Pope, you know, maybe on certain occasions will wash somebody's feet as a sort of a sign of, you know, following the Lord's example, right? And in fact, I was brought up a Seventh-day Adventist, and they have their communion 4 times a year, I believe. It's not anything like every week, so I think it's sort of fairly rare. I believe it's 4 times. Anyway, when they have it, they, well, certainly in the church I was in, they would always wash each other's feet prior to taking communion. So the women would go upstairs, the men would go into the side room, they would sit on chairs, you would pair up, the deacons would be helping out, you know, they would provide bowls of warm water and towels, and you would usually pray with the other person, and you would, you know, you would wash their feet, and then they would wash your feet, and dry it, and then you put your shoes and socks back on. So this sort of really made the communion experience very. I think that was in some respects why they had communion less frequently maybe than some church groups, because it kind of took up a lot more time. I don't think you would have had a very long sermon, or maybe they just made the service longer. I can't remember. It wasn't unknown to have pretty long services. So, yeah, I mean, I remember that, you know, we'd all meet together, we'd pair up, we'd wash each other's feet, we'd pray with each other. Usually there'd be maybe like a prayer or a hymn or a song with the men. You know, obviously I wasn't privy to what the women got up to, but I imagine it was something similar. And then, you know, all go back in again and take communion. So, I mean, my feeling now is that it isn't something to be kind of artificially practiced. I don't think there's any harm in it. I don't think you're doing disobedient if you don't do it. I think it was something that was a product of the time, that in the ancient world they did need to have their feet washed on a regular basis. When they were coming in into a house, basically on entering a house, it would have been fairly common to have your feet washed. This is why Jesus was complaining that the guy he'd visited didn't offer him water for his feet, so really he was being very rude to not do that. But it seems the most likely way of looking at it, I think the best way of looking at it, is simply that it was a custom in the ancient world, and Jesus had really suggested that rather than just giving somebody water to wash their feet with, maybe you should wash the other person's feet, or if the other person was a Christian, maybe to wash their feet. Maybe that was, it depends how you want to read what Jesus was doing, because he did it with his disciples. He didn't necessarily go and wash a Pharisee's feet or someone, or something like that. So without any further explanation, it's difficult to know quite what it means to take it as an example. But given that now we don't need to have our feet washed, it seems a little bit artificial maybe to do it. But like I said, I don't think it's there's anything wrong with doing it, and something to think about, something for discussion. I think the feeling of the group was that it's not a necessary thing. Right. So that was really basically where we were. Oh, the other thing, a couple of other things. So one was pride and humility and what it means to be humble. Being, acting as a servant and being humble doesn't mean having low self-esteem, and it doesn't mean thinking that you're not worth anything. It's an important thing. I think at the beginning of the chapter, it's like Jesus knowing where he'd come from, sort of Jesus knowing that he was the Son of God, still acted with humility. And I think we definitely should have positive self-esteem, self-respect, value ourselves, not feel that we're unworthy of being treated well, but at the same time that doesn't mean that you can't be a humble person, and you can't care for people and show kindness to them, that isn't a weakness. So so I think that's important to say, that to act in a humble way doesn't mean to not be feel good about yourself, right? The other thing is that these other two incidences in this chapter, Jesus predicting Judas's betrayal and Jesus predicting Peter's denial of him, it's important to realise that because he knew what was going to happen, he still washed Peter's feet, he still washed Judas's feet. And so, I think that adds an extra dimension to this, the humility of the foot washing, is that he was still, he still treated them the same as the other disciples. They hadn't, obviously, Judas hadn't betrayed Jesus at that point. I suppose to some extent, maybe he'd been having discussions or whatever with the authorities, but nevertheless, there he was with Jesus. Jesus still treated him the same. Peter obviously hadn't denied him at that point, although Jesus knew that he would. But again, he still treated Peter the same. So, I just think it makes it an even more profound experience, if you like, as to what Jesus was doing, in that he knew, what these two disciples had got, what was going to happen, and yet he still showed love and kindness to them. So, yes, that completes John 13. I hope you found that interesting, and we will continue next week, hopefully.